And we are live on YouTube. And those who want to rename themselves can do that. There is a function called rename. And we begin. Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight or this afternoon, depending on which meridian you are, for this almost anniversary edition of the Philosophical Cafe. It was 1 year ago, almost to the day, that we started this project, going online with what was before some friendly regular meetings to talk about books in a bookshop. And we began what is called now the Philosophy After Dark project. And we met almost every Friday since to discuss books, ideas, questions, debates of philosophical interest. And tonight, because this is almost the anniversary edition, but also because of the subject we are going to talk, I thought I should mark this somehow by pouring myself a glass of wine. Not only because I wanted to mark the day, but also because I have learned from the book we are going to discuss tonight that inside of this glass of wine lies hidden one of the philosophical stones, the vegetable stones of the alchemists. So I'm very much looking forward to hear more about that. I wish I would have a distillery at home to start the process while talking tonight. I'm sure you will find it interesting and fascinating. Joining me in co-hosting the meeting tonight is Georgiana Hedesan from Oxford University. Our guest is Jennifer Rampling from Princeton University. I will give the word to Jo to introduce our guest and ask the first question.
Hello, and welcome to a new installment of the Philosophical Cafe. I'm Jo Hedesan, and we will be moderating a discussion on a topic that is very dear to me, which is history of alchemy, of course. We are privileged to have with us today one of the foremost scholars in the topic, Jennifer Rampling, associate professor at Princeton University. She's the author of a new and a fascinating new book entitled The Experimental Fire, Inventing English Alchemy. Here it is, 1300 to 1700s, published by the University of Chicago Press. Now, the history of alchemy used to be a topic that historians of science would generally shun, as alchemy was often seen as a pseudoscience, a religious pursuit, or a product of a vaguely defined occult knowledge. These views have been challenged by the new historiography of alchemy. This new historiography has denied the differentiation between alchemy and chemistry prior to the 18th century and the advent of the Enlightenment. This view has been accompanied by a focus on the practical dimension of alchemy, with new attention being paid to what alchemists were actually doing in the laboratory. This coincides with a wider historical interest in materiality and embodiment, with a new focus being paid to objects, materials, practices, and physical interactions. From this angle, alchemy can be seen as a form of knowledge that was particularly inclined towards experimenting. And this experimental dimension is well captured by Jenny's new book, which records in detail the evolution of alchemy, in particular National English, over a long durée of 400 years. So Jenny, welcome to our Philosophical Cafe. I would like to kick off the discussion by saying that alchemy used to be seen as basically a static form of knowledge that didn't change over centuries. Yet, as you show in your book, alchemy was in fact a dynamic and innovative pursuit, changing remarkably actually over the course of 400 years. So can you tell us briefly how alchemy evolved in England from the Middle Ages to the early modern period?
Thank you very much, Joe. And let me just start by thanking both you and Dana for kindly inviting me to come and talk about the book. And it's lovely to see so many friends from both sides of the Atlantic in the audience as well. So in a way, the premise of the book started from exactly the problem that you just mentioned, Joe, which is this sense that alchemy remains static over long periods of time. And I think part of the reason for that is that the imagery often is recycled. So for example, I'm sure we've all seen the amazing alchemical images that often appear in alchemical manuscripts and printed books, showing symbols like the green lion devouring the sun. And because we keep seeing green lions over the period of hundreds of years, it's tempting to think that nothing's really changing underneath. The problem is that the green lion can mean different things at different times and to different practitioners. So for example, in the context of Arabic alchemy, it might be used to refer to vitriol, to green vitriol and metal sulfate. It might be used in the Latin Middle Ages to refer more generally to the philosophical mercury. George Ripley seems to have used it to refer to some kind of compound made from lead and copper. And then later readers interpreted it as antimony. So what we can see is symbols sort of floating on the surface of this churning culture of experimentation with different kinds of chemical approach, by a group of practitioners who were very interested in trying to revive past practices, but who also were perhaps even more intensely interested in making the philosopher's stone, the transmuting agent, which would of course make them extremely wealthy if they were ever successful. And as an additional benefit, they also looked at stones which could have medicinal value. So the optimum product might be something like the vegetable stone, which I talk about in the book, which is supposed to be safe to ingest. It's not toxic, so it can preserve your life, renew your youth, heal sickness. But if you mix it with other substances, which are not so easy to ingest, you can then make the transmuting mineral stone, which will transform metals. So this is the kind of alchemy that I noticed really developing in England over the period from about 1300 to 1700, the period I cover in the book. This intense interest in different applications of alchemy. So products for transmutation, products for medicine, products for making jewels, and so on. So it's a kind of multi-purpose art. But alchemists are interested in the underlying theories and precepts as well. And one of the puzzles that I had to try and decipher in the book was the way in which you have a rhetoric that always talks about alchemy as being one thing, one ingredient, one stone, one fire, one vessel, one practice. And then you actually dig into the practices and the recipes and you see what looks like a very diverse kind of practice. So in trying to follow what happened in England, I spent a lot of time trying to see how individual practitioners were trying to reconcile that language of unity and coherence with what was in practice rather a broad palette of practical approaches. And the one which I noticed coming up again and again is a practice that I mentioned earlier in relation to George Ripley. So Ripley is a 15th century Augustan canon, originally based in northeast England in the town of Bridlington, where there's a priory, and you can still see half of the original priory church there today. The other half was demolished by Henry VIII during the dissolution. George Ripley was a Yorkshireman. It's interesting that that part of Yorkshire has some lead mines, so possibly Ripley even encountered his raw materials while he was based in Bridlington. But either way, he formulated an alchemy that was supposed to be good for transmuting metals and healing human bodies that was based on a substance he called red lead or sericon, which almost certainly was not the kind of pure red lead that you would now order from a chemist's catalogue. But he thought that by dissolving this leaden compound in distilled vinegar, he'd get a substance that was simultaneously vegetable and mineral. So it draws on both traditions, if you like. And this just became incredibly popular. So generations of English alchemists keep going back to this Ripleyan formula and in the process reinterpreting it. So some tried experiments with red lead, didn't work. They substituted antimony, they liked that better. So there's a constant tension between text and practice as well in the story that I try to tell as I follow this English Sericonian practice, as I call it, so based on Ripley's cover name for the metal sericon over 4 centuries.
Jenny, let me just start by saying, I know nothing about alchemy. I want to know more. I know a bit about philosophy, and I was struck by the fact that when presenting your characters, one more interesting and more fantastic in a way than the other, some names that I knew, but I knew as philosophers or mathematicians, such as John Dee or Richard Eden, others completely unknown names. I was struck by the fact that you created a very interesting landscape of practitioners who were at the same time reading a lot. And the kind of things that they were reading were philosophical sources, which almost always had a pseudo in front of them. I have some of them here, actually. I have the pseudo Aristotle, the Secretum Secretorum, and the poor Raymond Lull, who is a very important character of your book, although one feels that perhaps the real Raymond Lull would have been a bit surprised by the kind of posterity he had. How is philosophy and practice kind of melted together in this melting pot of alchemy?
Thank you so much. That's such a crucial question. And in answering, I'd like to start by saying a little bit more about pseudepigraphy, because as you just pointed out quite rightly, many of the authorities that European alchemists were using in the late Middle Ages and the early modern period actually are not the people who historically wrote the text which are attributed to them. So pseudepigraphy is this very widespread trend in alchemical writing. And that's going to lead us straight into that tension that you just mentioned. So why would you attribute your work to somebody else? Well, sometimes it happens deliberately and sometimes it happens by accident. So things can happen accidentally very easily, partly because, I think this is a crucial point, alchemy was not part of the medieval university curriculum. It was not a discipline that had any kind of formal status. So it might be discussed in a university in the context of a dispute, but it's not actually going to be something people are taught. There were no guilds for alchemists. There's no kind of unquestionable authority that people can refer to. That means if you're looking for authority in your alchemical practice, you're really dependent on two sources, either written texts from the past or actual practitioners from the present. And perhaps talking about the search for contemporary practitioners is something we might come back to later in the discussion. But mostly where alchemists looked for authority was in texts from the past, which tended to be attributed to distinguished figures, none more distinguished than Hermes Trismegistus, in fact, a legendary figure, this supposed Egyptian sage who some thought was contemporary with Moses, and who in the medieval tradition was supposed to have been the inventor of alchemy. The problem is that once writers start trying to accommodate alchemical practice within a philosophical framework, so let's say they try to make it look Aristotelian in the 13th century because Aristotelian physics is the dominant way of approaching matter at the time, they might write a treatise that actually sounds so Aristotelian that it ends up getting attributed to Aristotle. It's very striking. You mentioned Raymond Lull, as he's called in England, Raymond Lull, because the historical Lull did not believe in alchemy, but he had at least one follower who was both a follower of Lull and an alchemist who tried to accommodate alchemical knowledge to Lull's philosophy. So he produced a very lengthy treatise, which I'm sure many in the audience will be familiar with, the Testamentum, which is a detailed theoretical exposition of alchemy with a long practica, which uses many of the kind of figures and tropes and methods of reasoning that were used by the philosopher Raymond Lull. So what could be more natural than for later readers to assume that the historical Lull had actually written this book as well and was really an alchemist? So that's what I mean by an accidental pseudepigraphy. But then you get deliberate pseudepigraphy as well. So later in the 14th century, so maybe half a century after the Testamentum was written, you get another writer who takes some ideas out of the Testamentum and mixes them together with ideas from another alchemical treatise, the book concerning the quintessence by a Franciscan, John of Upisissa. He melds them together, and he actually claims in the prologue to the work that he is Raymond Lull. So he is the philosopher Lull, and he's also the person who wrote the Testamentum. Now, and then this treatise went on to be ridiculously influential and successful. And I talk quite a lot about this combined treatise, which is called the book concerning the secrets of nature, or the quintessence, the Liber de Secretis Naturae, in my book. Now, if you sort of jump forwards 100 years or so to the age of someone like George Ripley, and you are trying to make sense both of experiment and of history, where do you look for evidence? Well, sources like the De Secretis Naturae might be your starting point. But the problem is, because it's attributed to Raymond Lull, to start with, you're going to misdate it by assuming it was written, during Lull's lifetime, over half a century earlier. And secondly, you're perhaps going to invest it with additional authority because you think it's written by this great philosopher. So over time, these pseudepigraphic attributions pile up, and they actually give us a kind of alternative history, a history in which philosophers really did alchemy. And several of the treatises attributed to these famous philosophers are also dedicated to kings. So they're not really addressed to kings, they're sort of fictively addressed to kings. Sometimes the kings don't even exist, but they're framed as letters written by philosophers to monarchs, which again creates this kind of fictive history that a lot of later readers really seized onto, because it seemed to give them evidence that these philosophers in the past were not only making the philosopher's stone, they were actually working on behalf of royalty to make it, which made an amazing platform for their own attempts to seek investment from princes in their own time. So this is really, to answer your original question, Dana, this is how I see reading and practice being intimately related, because the alchemists learn about everything from these written texts, which can also be invested with enormous authority.
We already have quite a bit of questions, so we'd better proceed to them. Daniel Garber from Princeton University is up. And I would like to ask all of you, when you start talking, just to introduce yourselves. Of course, Dan Garber doesn't need an introduction, but when you start talking, it would be good for people that are in the audience to know who you are. So just briefly. Please, Dan.
Thank you very, very much. I'm Dan Garber from Princeton University, a colleague of Jenny's. And this is what it is I was sort of curious about. And in a way, it continues Donna's question about relationship between alchemy and philosophy. One of the striking things I think about your account of the history of alchemy is the way in which alchemy progresses through experimentation, obviously, but also through the reinterpretation of earlier texts. And there's something very much like that goes on in the philosophical world, at least until the early modern period. I mean, there are, starting in late 16th, early 17th century, there are people who are thinking that they're doing something new. But certainly from the 13th century up until then, and in many contexts, well into the late 17th and early 18th century, philosophy progresses by commentary, reinterpretation, doing what they're thinking of as figuring out what the real meaning of the text is, but of course changing them very often. Can you say something about how that tradition in philosophy might relate to the kind of thing that you're seeing going on among your alchemists?
Thank you very much, Dan. It's very nice to see you here. So this is a central question in the book, I think. I suppose I was interested in looking to see how this kind of exegetical technique is already very familiar from, say, the Aristotelian commentary tradition, how that transfers over to scientific fields. Can we see alchemical texts or other medical texts and so on? Can we see them being read in the same kind of way? And if so, what's the place of practice in that? Because clearly there's more happening in these alchemical reinterpretations than simply trying to unpack the meaning of the text, although that's extremely important. So first of all, it's worth mentioning that many of the writers of alchemical texts would have actually been trained in that kind of tradition. So George Ripley probably studied at university, although we don't know which one, because he did actually receive permission to leave his order and travel abroad in order to study at a university. And there's a poem that's attributed to him which mentions studying at Louvain, so it's possible he went to the Low Countries, but you know, whether that's the place where he studied or not, there just isn't the evidence to say for sure. So in the book, I tried to coin a term to deal with this problem of how we factor practice and experimentation into this long tradition of sort of successive cycles of textual commentary. And I call it practical exegesis. And I see it as a kind of feedback loop. So it would work something like this. You're an alchemist, maybe you know a little bit about practice already. You get a new text, let's say it's a text by George Ripley, that's telling you how to make the vegetable stone using this substance called sericon. And you've never heard of sericon before, but you know that Ripley's an acclaimed philosopher, so you want to follow his process. The problem is you first of all have to work out what sericon is. So you consult other books and you think about your own practical knowledge, and from combining these sources of information together, you try to come up with your best guess of what the term actually means. The problem is, as I've just said before, chemical knowledge doesn't remain static and fashions change. So it seems to me that in the late 15th century, everybody was very excited about the stuff that they call red lead, which might have been what we'd call red lead, or it might have been something completely different. And dissolving lead in vinegar and then distilling it, basically to produce sort of what we now call lead acetate or sugar of lead, which you can distill again and you get acetone. I mean, this is a real chemical process. That seems to have been in vogue. So probably Ripley's contemporaries would not have struggled too much with the kind of process he was describing. The trouble is, 100 years later, I think that's come to seem a little bit passé. So what you notice when you look at readers' books, you look at how they annotate the text, they start talking about another possible ingredient, antimony. I mean, it's not the only one, it gets interpreted as all kinds of things, but antimony is one that clearly was in vogue in the later 16th century, partly because by that time it's been enormously popularized by the medical writings of Paracelsus and his followers. It's a huge part of practical medicine. Alexander von Schuchten's written treatises about the wonderful role of antimony in metallurgical processes. So everybody's investigating antimony. So if you read about this reddish mineral that can dissolve gold safely, and you're also familiar with antimony, which has a reddish colored ore and which can be used to purge gold, you might think, he's clearly talking about antimony. And so you begin a whole palette of experiments based on essentially a faulty premise. But the question is it really faulty? And this to me is the most enticing question. Did people realize they were innovating? Because it's possible that they knew they were creatively reading the text. This is a kind of conjectural emendation. But it's also possible that they really thought they were reconstructing the process as intended by Ripley, in which case they've changed the chemistry without even knowing it. And then when they write their own treatise, which they very often did, they kind of write it building on Ripley, but putting antimony in place of sericon, which is then read by the next generation of philosophers who bring exactly the same set of questions to bear, and maybe they read it as something else, or maybe they stick with antimony. Maybe in the case of George Starkey, they flip it entirely from being a medicinal approach to being a transmutational approach. But through all these different changes, the reputation of the authority, George Ripley, just sort of bobs along the surface like a happy little boat, because he's still being approved as the authority for this process, even as the chemistry changes. Something I just think is fascinating.
Well, so it's obvious that insofar as the alchemical texts are intending to be talking about something in the world, and not just as the philosophical texts often are, arguments and so on. But you do have this other element of interpretation going on to try to link it up to particular kinds of things in the world. And but there's an interesting sort of meta level here too. Isn't it the case that you, as the contemporary historian of this, have got to do roughly the same thing with these texts that you're reading? It isn't obvious what chemicals, you talk about these in terms of modern chemicals and modern chemical reactions, but isn't there a certain amount of exactly the same kind of interpretation going on for the historian as for these practitioners in the earlier period?
Dan, it's exactly the same thing. You're absolutely on the money. The only significant difference that I can see is that I don't believe it's going to work, whereas presumably most of my practitioners did, or they wouldn't have spent so long doing it. No, I mean, and this is something I mentioned in the book, and you know, I'm just fascinated in it from a methodological point of view. In trying to recover these changes in chemistry over time, I have to learn to think like an alchemist, which means I have to try and read text in the same way that they did, which means you can't really learn from just one book. You have to read quite widely. Basically, this is the kind of advice that the alchemists themselves give to their readers. You know, they say, you know, you must read many books, but you have to read the right books because some of the books are bad and these are the good books. And of course, they all disagree about what the good books are. So you have to make that judgment call, and so do I. And then you also have to try and think about possible ingredients that you can use. So that's why when I talk about chemicals, I usually try to qualify it by saying, you know, what we would now call, or, you know, it's not quite the same. Because we can never really know. So in the book, you have my best reconstruction of what I think these alchemists were doing. But at the end of the day, it's my best guess. And somebody else might come along and write a book where they argue that actually, no, I'm completely wrong because they were using, you know, arsenic or something like that. And I've missed some vital clue. And of course, this is a great excuse for the alchemists as well, because if they get it wrong, they can just say, you know, I read that term incorrectly. Because what's more likely, that you made a mistake because these books are heavily encoded, or the entire science of alchemy is false? Well, obviously the first is much more likely.
Thank you.
There are a number of questions, and we were wondering how to proceed. But since we are here, and I would like to bring you back to kind of more general issues on the same line for those who do not know anything about alchemy again. Let me try to push you, Jenny, on a different example, namely the way in which, let's say, the founder of English alchemy, George Ripley, read a very diverse corpus of texts and practices that he received back in the Middle Ages. So what you're making a very interesting and convincing case in the book, that somehow, besides these pseudo-epigraphic sources, there are two major sources of alchemy. One is the multiplication of metals, so some sort of forgery. And the other one is distillation of brandy, basically, okay, aqua vita, aqua fortis, things like this. And you make a very nice case of George Ripley bringing everything together by saying that somehow we have to put together this metallurgical tradition that wants to obtain gold with a medical tradition that wants to obtain very good brandy and hopes that drinking brandy leads to long life. And he does something like what you call the practical exegetics, namely he talks about vegetable mercury, which, okay, it's an absurdity, isn't it? So what is this vegetable mercury or vegetable mercuries?
Thank you. Okay, so to answer your question, I think, if I may, I'm just going to slightly recharacterize the picture of alchemy that you just set out. To begin with, I would never call George Ripley the founder of English alchemy. I'm very much opposed to calling anybody the founder of anything, because you know, that seems to be asking for trouble. You'll then find actually they had all these interesting antecedents who, of course, you know, heavily inform their work. So Ripley wouldn't have seen himself as founding anything. He would have seen himself probably as a good commentator on pseudo-Lullian alchemy, which in fact he was. The process by which his reputation turned him from a pseudo-Lullian continental commentator into the doyen of English alchemy is something that's very interesting, and it has its own history and happens sort of in the following centuries, and perhaps we'll get a chance to come back to that. But you were asking me about this multi-stranded approach to alchemy, and I think here the distinction isn't necessarily between transmutation and medicine as it is between the idea that both goals could be products of the same stone or the same thing, and the idea that they would require different processes and different things to make them work. So just to explain what I mean, you do find descriptions in other 13th and 14th century Latin alchemical treatises. These are continental treatises, not necessarily English treatises, which talk about the healing power of the stone. So for example, well, Raymond Lull is one, pseudo-Lull, but there's also pseudo-Arnold of Villanova. The historical Arnold was a famous physician from Montpellier, who probably didn't write any of the alchemical works attributed to him. But these pseudo-Arnaldian works talk about producing a stone that will transmute metals, and then they also talk about it as though it has medicinal properties as well. This is something that's actually been studied quite a lot by scholars like Michele Pereira and Antoine Calvet. What starts to develop in the pseudo-Lullian corpus is the idea that you don't need one process to produce all of this. You actually produce different stones. And this idea of a multiplicity of stones comes out of a way of interpreting actually the term you just mentioned, Dana, vegetable mercury. So in the book, I mentioned this famous lemma from the pseudo-Aristotelian Secretum Secretorum, where pseudo-Aristotle says there is a stone and it's animal and it's vegetable and it's mineral and it's a stone, but it's not a stone. So it's a series of paradoxes. Now you can interpret that different ways. You can say that animal, vegetable, and mineral are just being used metaphorically here. So the stone is vegetable because it has some ability to multiply itself. You know, its sort of generative power can be increased, like a plant. And it's sometimes called animal because it has a soul that you can extract. So, you know, one trope you often encounter in medieval alchemical writing is the idea that you can separate a metal into its body, soul, and spirit as part of the alchemical work. So it's animated, it's ensouled. So these could be used as, so vegetable and animal could be used metaphorically to talk about properties of mercury, for instance. Or you could choose to interpret it literally and say that there really is a vegetable, a mineral, and an animal product. So if you're using that approach, then mercury becomes the metaphor. So by mercury, you just mean some kind of liquid substance. So a vegetable mercury might be the spirit of wine or distilled vinegar, or possibly some combination of vegetable and mineral substances such as lead dissolved in vinegar. It can be all kinds of things. Animal mercury could be blood. So when you're trying to work out what's actually happening in a text, the first thing you have to do is work out, is the author following a sort of pseudo-Arnaldian approach or a pseudo-Lullian approach or a Ripley's approach? How do they actually mean these stones? Do they mean them to be the same thing or different things? And they'll usually be very explicit about it. So for example, in the pseudo-Arnaldian corpus, pseudo-Arnold will set up dialogues where the master is talking to a disciple, and the disciple will say something like, "Tell me, master, why is it called the animal mercury?" And Arnold will then say, "Ah, my son, it's just, you should not read that literally. Only a fool would read it literally. It actually means," and then goes on to tell you. And these treatises are amazing because they're actually teaching readers how to read like an alchemist. It's telling you how to read on multiple levels. But then you have this shift where it starts to be read as meaning different products. And that becomes very popular, I argue, in 15th century England for the simple reason that, it's much easier to make these different products than it is to make one kind of universal stone that does everything. It gives you access to a wider range of ingredients, substances, processes. It's just, you can get a lot further with less. And there's also an issue about cost, which I won't go into here if anybody's interested. You know, there is an interesting question about how you can make the work affordable for the poor as well.
Well, Stephen has had a question for a while. Stephen Klukas from University of London at Birkbeck. Stephen?
Hi. You've kind of taken away the need to introduce myself, but I am Stephen Klukas from Birkbeck, University of London. Jenny, my question follows on from the discussion you were having with Dan about practical exegesis. Now, I happen to know, and any of the readers of the book of your book will know, that you have actually not only tried to think like an alchemist, but actually to perform experiments like an alchemist. And I suspect your experience is more extensive than you let on in the book. So I'd just like to invite you to talk to us about the ways in which your book and your concept of practical exegesis have been informed by your own attempts at practically replicating experiments, or indeed the work of others who've been engaged in similar activities.
Thanks very much, Stephen, and it's good to see you here. Yeah, so your intuition is quite correct. Most of the stuff on experiment is going into the next book, where I talk more about alchemical images and bring in some of my experimental experience, by which time I will hopefully have more experimental experience, because the pandemic has rather thrown a wedge in my plans to be in the lab in the last year. So yes, thinking like an alchemist, I think inevitably means trying to practice like an alchemist as well. And this is something that I've also learned from other historians of alchemy, like Lawrence Principe in particular, and Bill Newman, who have discovered that by, well, two things. First of all, that actually trying to translate texts into practices is much, much harder than you might think. So it's one thing to say, this is obviously antimony, and it's another thing to actually go into, you know, your workroom and try the same experiment with antimony and see if it works. And secondly, I'd say the second lesson I've learned is that you can really use practice as a kind of philological technique to understand the text. So, and I think you can sometimes catch the practitioners themselves doing this. So for instance, George Ripley, he's trying to follow a recipe from Pseudo Lull that says that you can dissolve gold in quintessence of wine. And he complains, well, actually, this doesn't work. You can't dissolve gold in spirit of wine. No matter how many times you distill the wine, it's never sharp enough. Therefore, it must be something else. And I've had the same experience that, you know, certainly using pure lab ingredients, you know, something works or it doesn't work. Does that mean the text is wrong, or does it mean I'm misreading it? And like an alchemist, I tend to assume I'm misreading it most of the time. So I'll give you an example which I actually I use in the book because it's incredibly striking, and it's a sort of, it's not really a process, it's an effect. It's a visual effect called the gliding fire. And it appears in the Bosom book, which is this collection of recipes attributed to George Ripley, which really started circulating during the reign of Elizabeth I, so especially the last quarter of the 16th century in England. And one of the effects that's described in the course of a recipe is that you distill basically this lead in vinegar compound, and you end up with this black stuff in the bottom of the glass that just looks like, you know, kind of burnt black rubbish, which the text calls the black dragon or black feces. And if you put it onto a marble stone and then you put a charcoal next to it, and then the text says that, you know, over a period of time, over say a quarter of an hour, this most wonderful golden color will spread through the black feces like a gliding fire, making it a most beautiful citrine color, so a yellow color that's glorious to behold. It sounds, you know, sort of rather suspicious, but it works very beautifully. And in chemical terms, what's happening is very simple, because the black stuff is really just very finely divided lead, which of course, you know, oxidizes to make litharge, which is bright yellow. So what you're really seeing is the oxidization of litharge, to use modern chemical terminology. But, you know, you don't have access to oxidization as a term in the 1570s. So perhaps you say it looked like a gliding fire. And it's visually quite dramatic. What I really learned from that is, first of all, it works. And secondly, there's something almost unearthly about watching it happen. So you can see this yellow color spread through the black. It's a striking color change. Nobody would have thought, I have to emphasize this, nobody seeing that would have thought they were seeing gold being made. It's obviously not gold. But it could be used perhaps as an argumentative point. Where's the yellow coming from? Is it inside the black? So much alchemical theory is predicated on this idea that there were occult properties as well as the manifest properties. And you, as the alchemist, your job is to make those occult properties manifest. So we bring out the yellow in the black, and perhaps later you can bring out the gold from the lead. So I think it would have had powerful rhetorical impact. But something else I learned wasn't written in the original experiment. And do I mention it in the book? I think I mentioned it in the book. This stuff's really pyrophoric. So if you take it straight out of the flask, while it's still hot, there's a good chance it's going to ignite on contact with the air, which, if you want to impress somebody by doing the charcoal thing, you need to get your charcoal onto the black lead quickly before it goes up by itself. And I know this firsthand because I was filmed doing this by BBC 4. And because the whole point was to show that the charcoal ignited it, I had to sort of get that charcoal on there really quickly because I was afraid it would just start doing it. And we had one take. But at the same time, you can find in early modern text references to this pyrophoric quality. Several sources, one of which I attribute to Edward Kelly, John Dee's squire, actually describe the black substance being kindled of its own accord, so on contact with air. So I wasn't the only person to see this. So one of the great insights I had from that experimental reconstruction was the realization that I thought I'd seen something new that wasn't in the original recipe, but early modern readers had also seen the same new thing and written about it. And you can really get a sense then of the mechanism by which chemical knowledge changes just because of the knowledge of nature that doing the practice actually gives you.
Thanks very much, Jenny.
Jenny, one thing that I really liked about your book was how it sought to define alchemy in terms of the activity of alchemy. We're quite used to thinking of it in terms of the goals, in terms of making philosopher's stone or making medicine. But it is very, it's particularly fascinating to look at what they were doing actually. Here, I mean, you define alchemy basically in terms of reading and doing. And I found that quite interesting because there is something radical about thinking about reading and doing in conjunction. I mean, we have this mental image of the philosopher as being, kind of static, in the study, thinking, not doing something. So there is this this divide of the study and the laboratory. But you actually say that alchemists were both reading and doing, and I was trying to imagine. I mean, did they? How did this work? I mean, did they bring the book into the laboratory? Did they read first and then they were trying things, or they went back and forth between the study and the laboratory? I mean, how would you describe this process, and how would this redefine the way we see reading as an activity?
Thanks very much, Joe. So to begin with, we shouldn't see reading as distinct from practice. Reading is a practice. It's just that, I think because we privilege text in a way as something that's abstract and kind of floating in the air somehow. But, when we're reading a book, the text is there. It's part of the material, of the book, which means that, the form in which the book arrives on your desk is going to affect your experience of reading it. And we can see this passing into practice, I think. So as people read, their book, they might annotate the margins because they're having ideas about how the text relates to practice. So they're reading for practice in a way, and by practice, I don't mean reading practices, I mean chemical practices, of course. So, you know, in a way they're thinking about the physical processes as they're reading the text. And then when they're in their, you know, let's call it a lab, when they're in their lab actually trying to carry out the experiment, they're thinking of the text. And the way they record it will often use expressions from the text. So, you know, Ripley says it turns green here, but actually I found it turned green at a later stage. And, you know, so, you know, this is where you can see the two in a continual state of interplay. I think if we think of it all as practice, that's a helpful way forwards, perhaps. In fact, one thing I was really trying to do with the book was to, you know, bring the history of science and the history of experiments into close conversation with the scholarship that's been done on book history, especially over the last few decades, when, you know, the history of scholarship has really brought our attention to the ways in which books were read, the ways in which notes were recorded, and there's lots of fascinating work being done on this, you know, across many kinds of historical source material, not just obviously alchemy or scientific material. And actually, I've learned a lot from history of the book and history of reading about how people actually approached their texts and how they read them. So that when I see the same techniques being used in alchemical books, I can ask, is the reader using a set of techniques that they've learned from school maybe, or from learning how to read other materials such as church fathers? Are they bringing the same techniques to bear on alchemical materials, or are they reading them in a fundamentally different way? And actually it can be either. So sometimes you'll see a very sort of scholastic method of reading where most of the marginal notes are actually cross-references to other books. So, you know, see Geber, page 300, and you go to Geber, page 300, and you can see that, yes, that passage is directly relevant to the one that's in the anchor text. Or sometimes you can see it being read in a more distinctive way. So the example I gave before, such as actually trying to translate it into a practice. So when John Dee reads the recipe in the bosom book, as I mentioned earlier, with the guiding fire, that recipe starts by mentioning Sericon, George Ripley's favourite ingredient, and Dee writes in the margin, Sericon, red lead, but then he draws underneath it the chemical symbol for antimony, suggesting that he thought that this process started with antimony. And actually, we have some records of Dee's laboratory notes. So, you know, it's very interesting to then go to those notes to see what he was doing in practice, informed with the insights that you've gleaned from his reading practices. But I hope that gets to what you were asking.
Yes, thank you.
Let me try to push forward the same kind of question in a different language and maybe connect it with other fields, because early modern thought is, and Renaissance even more, is a field where you have allegorical reading at every step. The big question is how, or the question is, how does the practical exegetics stands in comparison with other forms of exegetics? But let me just give you some examples. You know, that we know that one field where people read carefully in view of finding what words really mean was the reading of the scriptures, and they really wanted to know, let's imagine the ages of the earth, or the end of the world and things like this. So there was a lot of, in chronology, there is one big chunk of allegorical reading. The meaning of ancient fables is another big chunk of allegorical reading. Newton is talking about the pipes of Pan, and he takes that to mean something about the music of the planets. And Bacon talks about the hunt of Pan. He takes that to mean some sort of experimental method. More connected with practice, you know, and more familiar to everyone in the audience, even the non-early modern philosophers and the non-alchemical historians of alchemy audience, so the general audience. There is an example that is familiar to us all, looking for the lost continent of Atlantis. here you have the ancient text and the practice. The practice is navigation and map making and so on. Okay, so how does practical exegesis in your interpretation stands between all these examples?
Thank you very much. It's a good question. And I suppose that if you were actually trying to find Atlantis and you thought you had got the location from your sources, and then you actually sailed a boat to the place that you think you'd identified, that would kind of be practical exegesis. So, you'd sail there and, oh, Atlantis isn't there. So you sail back home again, and then you correct the text and say, actually, that interpretation wasn't right because I went and tried it and it wasn't correct. So it's the feedback loop, which is essential. It's the idea that you don't just work it through as a thought experiment, you actually seek further evidence, or if you like, seek further philological refinements from nature, from experimentation. And what I see as another intrinsic aspect of practical exegesis is that you can innovate, or you can innovate without intending to, because you think you're getting at the true sense of the text. Because of course, if you were deliberately innovating, that wouldn't be exegesis, it would be eisegesis. But I think many actors actually did have a sense that they were correctly reading the source, whereas in actual fact, they're changing the underlying chemistry. So I see that as part of the feedback loop as well. This is what happens to the reading material when you bring in your own experiments. The meaning of the text can change, sometimes without your even noticing it, which of course, then to go back to Dan's meta problem means that the next reader, say it's me as the historian, then has to try and work out if the interpretation is accurate or if it's, just an interpretation. And I think that the nature of this kind of reading is also shaped by the allegorical nature of the source material, as you note. That seems to be essential. So another genre of reading which is difficult like this is prophecy. So, since you mentioned scripture, take the book of Revelation. John of Patmos is clearly, producing a vision, an allegory, if you like, that seems to have been about Rome. But then, in the 14th century, and even earlier, of course, medieval readers were looking in Revelation for guidance for their own time, for the coming millennium, and frankly, people are still reading it in exactly the looking for that kind of information today as well. So we might say historically going well beyond John's original intention, but because Rome is, ancient Rome is no longer a political factor, we have to interpret it in different ways if we want it to be relevant to our current life. So it's perhaps not the best analogy with interpreting an alchemical text, but just to sort of labor on down that path a bit longer, if dissolving lead in quintessence of wine is completely out of fashion, everybody knows it makes maybe a nice medicine, but it's not the elixir of life. But that's what Ripley seems to be saying. Well, that can't be what he means, because it just isn't relevant anymore. Therefore, he must have meant something else. So the style of writing almost forces later generations to impose new readings. And it also means that the Philosopher's Stone will always be one step ahead of you. Because by the time you get to whatever the correct reading was, or the original authorial intention, the chemistry's changed, so it's no longer seen as being relevant. So it must be something else.
Well, we have quite a lot of questions coming in, so we'll try to get to all of them if we can. Monica Solomon has been asking a question. Monica?
Oh, thank you. I'll be short. So I'm only maybe 1/3 through your book, and I love it. I'm not a historian of alchemy, so I'm more of a philosopher of science. But I was really interested in how you describe the relation between philosophers and alchemists, and then just as I guess social organization of alchemists, the fact that they could not work alone, and that meant they had to have a network of exchanging materials, gathering, working together. And what I didn't really, maybe that as a social organization of science, I could have anticipated, but it was interesting how they saw the relation with the king and the fact that the king needed money at some point. So, they could have provided some wealth. So that was a relation that maybe you could just tell us more and people who are watching on YouTube. And I have a second question, which is more philosophical, but I think you've answered it in waves. But if you could just hone this point, I would really love, which is how would the alchemists how would they know if they achieved something worth keeping, right? So how would they know if they actually replicated something? The example that you gave of the gliding fire is kind of illustrating that point. But were they, I mean, how in practice, like how would they know if they got the right answer, or if they want to improve, and what would they choose to write down as an improvement to a recipe? So I think there are some decisions that have to be made, and I don't know how would I make them, because I don't know alchemy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, and thank you for reading the book as well. And it's great to get questions sort of outside the immediate field as well. And if I may, I'm actually going to respond to your second point first. I think that when you get to chapter 7, you'll find that and chapter 8 is quite a bit on this exactly this problem, because this is the age-old problem of alchemy, isn't it? It doesn't work. You can't transmute metals this way. So why did people spend so much time and effort, and over so many years of their own lives, and over so many successive generations, doing something that doesn't work? And these are very intelligent people in many cases. So I think one of the reasons is that they actually did feel validated by some of their practical results. I mean, they feel validated in their successes, and they feel validated in their failures. So by successes, I mean, if you actually produce something that's described in the text, or something which you think is the thing described in the text, that's going to hearten you. So in the book, I call these tokens. And often the alchemists do as well. They'll say, and then you will receive this sign, signa, or this token, as it's often translated in English. So the gliding fire is a token. Another famous token is the mercurial tree, which Lawrence Principe has written about. If you grow this sort of amazing tree out of mercury in the flask, and it's described in the text, you're going to think, yes, I'm on the right lines. The problem is something always goes wrong at some point that prevents you from completing the process. But even in that failure, you can feel validated because you knew you were on the right lines, and you could just have misread the text. You could have misinterpreted it. You could have a bad copy. Many keen alchemical readers try to obtain multiple copies so they can cross-reference to see if anything's missing. This is something that the editors of printed books often complain about as well, that their manuscript wasn't very good, so they had to find another one, and so on. There's always an excuse, and actually critics of alchemy seized on this in their criticisms. So Vanuccio Biringuccio, in his famous book, Pyrotechnica, where he writes about metallurgical arts, actually mentions at the beginning that he started out interested in alchemy, and he spent years trying to practice it. And he came to the conclusion that there were just too many steps, and there's too much that can go wrong at every stage. And therefore you'd have to be, almost superhuman to get through it with without mishap. And so on those grounds, he kind of threw up his hands. And Francis Bacon said much the same. Right, so to go to your first question, which I have to say is one I'm very excited about, which is, if you like, communities of alchemists. And this is something that I really found myself learning about as I was writing the book. Because if we buy the alchemist rhetoric, which we shouldn't, they tend to talk about learning alchemy as a process of master and disciple. So you find a master who has the secret, and you study 15 years, 20 years under this master, and then finally, possibly on their deathbed, they will pass the secret down to you. And many alchemical treatises are actually framed in this way. They're framed as treatises written by the master to their philosophical son. So they'll begin something like, now my son, I will teach you the secrets of alchemy, but because, God does not wish this knowledge to fall into the hands of ill-disposed persons, I must speak obliquely. And, of course, then you get many of the familiar metaphors. So that's the rhetoric. But what actually happened in practice? Well, acquiring alchemical knowledge and then putting it into practice was a very complicated business. And in practice, it seems to have involved many actors. And one of the things I found most exciting when researching the book was identifying some of these communities that hadn't previously been known about. And the reason they hadn't been known about is because actually the indications of their existence are extremely fragmentary. So often it means, finding a name that's been crossed out in a manuscript, or noticing that one manuscript that was owned by person A is written in the same handwriting as person B that you know because you've seen person B's manuscript somewhere else, and therefore you realise they must have known each other because they're commenting on one another's books. And quite a lot of the my case studies were put together in that kind of way over the space of several years, when I'd literally call up a manuscript in an archive, having no idea who'd written it, and opening the book and thinking, hey, I've seen that handwriting before, or I recognise that name. So to give you an example, I talk about in the book Henry VIII's librarian, Giles Duez. I think if you're up to chapter 3, this is the next chapter, so this is chapter 4. So maybe I shouldn't give you spoilers, but he was the librarian and he collected alchemical books, and he actually seems to have collected medieval manuscripts and then copied them out and patched them up. And he was a good librarian looking after his books. But he also knew another alchemist called Robert Greene of Welby, who's a bit better known because he's mentioned in a satirical poem where he's criticised as a false alchemist, which was printed much later. And I noticed that several of the books in Duez's handwriting were actually, they had Robert Greene's name at the bottom of the transcriptions, and that seemed really odd to me. And they were even catalogued as, by Robert Greene. And eventually I realised it's because Robert Greene, who must have acquired the books from Duez, has actually erased his friend's name and written his own over the top, which, just hadn't been spotted. So immediately, so I already knew that they must have known each other because there's a manuscript in Trinity College, Cambridge, which has both of their writing in, and they're actually talking to each other. So there's a note that says, that Duez gave the book to Robert Greene. But now there seems to be this interesting tension in their relationship as well, because why did Greene cross out his friend's name? What's happening there? And by looking at the different ways in which they talked about alchemy, it was possible to put together a sense of, the different ways in which they practiced and how they learned from one another's manuscripts. And then because, I also found some legal records about a monk who actually ended up in court in the Star Chamber because he'd gone out to try and find an alchemist to teach him how to practice, because all he had were books in the library. And all I'll say for now is that it ended up very badly. The alchemist ends up suing him and he ends up in court, and it's all a bit of a mess, really. But just those little records and references can sometimes lead to whole networks of practitioners. And although some of these networks involve people who are quite well known, like John Dee and Edward Kelly, many of them are not at all well known or haven't been really featured at all in histories of alchemy. So I just want to emphasize the importance of people we don't know about in histories. We shouldn't just assume everything's about George Ripley and John Dee. Some of the most exciting stories, I think, come from people who aren't so well known, but who are nonetheless doing really interesting things, both philosophically and practically.
I'd like to push this a bit forward, this difference between successful alchemists and unsuccessful alchemists, successful experiments and unsuccessful experiments, because the example you just gave us comes very nicely in the book. And you seem to be saying that, one of the two friends writes in such a way that he becomes a famous alchemist, while the other one, by acknowledging his failures and writing in a less, or in a more transparent way, in a less abscons way, as a result becomes much less known. And Juana Matei has a question on this. What does it count as a successful experiment? Juana, if you want to address the question directly.
Thanks. Donna, should I respond to you, or should I wait for Oana to come in?
I think perhaps it's very much connected. So Oana is here, so she can ask her question.
I'm sorry, I just forgot to turn on my microphone. So I was speaking, but you weren't able to hear me. So hello, Jenny. Thank you for being here. I'm Juana Matei. I'm a Romanian scholar working on, let's say, the Britannia reception in the mid-17th century England. But my question to Jenny is that how can you, were there any criteria for a successful chemical experiment? How do you qualify? By replicating successfully an experiment that you read about, you know, recipe somewhere, or by contrast, by being able to continue somehow the experiment or to improve it?
Thank you very much, Joanna. It's lovely to see you as well. Yeah, so I think there are two broad ways in which you can be successful as an alchemist. And one is the kind that Dana alluded to. So the example I give in the book is actually it's Duez and Green, who I just mentioned. So Duez doesn't seem to have been as invested in practice, but he did write a philosophical style treatise, which became very popular. So it continued to be copied, and it was translated into English after his death, and it was eventually printed in the Theatrum Chemicum, this very important compendium of alchemical works, and made him, at least in the Latinized form of his name, Exegesis de Varus, an alchemical authority in his own right, even though the text is completely useless if you want to practice. It sets down lots of philosophical precepts, but it doesn't tell you how to start your work. It just covers everything in the mantle of philosophy, which means he can never be proved wrong. Whereas Robert Greene was really interested in practice, describes his failures as well as his successes. So he describes making some wonderful tokens like the mercurial tree, but he admits that at the end of the day, he was never able to make the stone. And because of that, his reputation, was not in the same league later. So, he's satirized in this poem by William Bloomfield, who calls him a philosopher, not a philosopher, because, he was using the wrong ingredients. And even when his work was eventually published, his name was removed from it, and the pessimistic ending was removed as well and replaced by a more sort of typical piece of philosophical boilerplate. So clearly, people who read Robert Greene's treatise didn't like the admission of failure. So that's one way in which you become a successful alchemist, at least over time, even if you don't get to enjoy the fruits yourself. It's by writing the kind of treatise that can survive you, that can survive failure, because it can't be interpreted sufficiently clearly to be falsified. And this is what really powers George Ripley's great success. The fact that, the way he framed his Saraconian process meant it could be continually reinterpreted. It's the same way we love the literary classics today, because, we can always bring something new to them. They always seem to say something about our time and place, whether it's, Shakespeare or Pride and Prejudice or whatever. Recipes were much more subject to criticism because recipes tend to be a bit more precise. So if you say, take half a pound of X and 2 ounces of Y, there's much less room for evolution, although you can claim that they meant X and Y metaphorically and really they meant something else. I think this is one reason why recipes tend to receive more flack than philosophical treatises over time. The other way in which you can become a successful alchemist is if you convince people that you either have the stone or you are very close to making it. Because if you have that reputation, you're going to be able to leverage it for enormous personal gains. So we see this in the 16th century, in the 1560s, with this Dutch alchemist Cornelius de Lannoy, who was actually appointed by Elizabeth I to do alchemy. She funded him, the only time she really did this. And because he had this royal patronage, he was able to extend fabulous lines of credit. He was lending money to people, which he didn't have yet. He was negotiating with, a member of the Swedish royalty to sort of go and set up in Sweden as well. He had everything except the actual stone. So of course, everything fell flat for him once that failed to manifest. But I think the most spectacular example is Edward Kelly, who I talk about in the 8th chapter of the book, because Kelly really managed to convince people that he had the practical skill. And there are so many supposed eyewitness accounts of his spectacular effects. It's very hard as a historian to judge what was going on. So, for instance, he's supposed to have publicly made in front of the emperor, Rudolf II, the Mercurius Solis, the mercury of gold, which he did in a 15-minute demonstration where he took this mercury, poured it into a ball of gold, and the mercury of gold just came pouring out of it. Well, that's what his his audience thought they were seeing. Now, because the mercury of gold is an important step on the way to making the Philosopher's Stone, clearly everybody was convinced that he was on the verge of success, or perhaps already had it. And what's so interesting is that even after Kelly was imprisoned, people didn't necessarily stop believing that he had the secret. So you could say in a sense, he even continued to be successful after the emperor had him thrown into prison, because as I'm able to show in the book, the emperor was still had him continue to practice while he was in prison, and then he was eventually released, although never to quite the same position as he had previously. So this question of success is a very tricky one. Perhaps ultimately the most successful kinds of alchemists are people like Michael Sendivogius, the Polish practitioner who was also at the court of Rudolf II in Prague, who very wisely said that he didn't have the secret himself, but he'd sort of been given the stone by somebody else. So he didn't have the knowledge. And he ended up, as Raphael Prink has shown, being able to marry a rich widow and build himself a nice house. And in the end, his success came from the reputation, but not from actually making the stone. Thank you.
Well, we'll actually come back to Kelly, because there was a question about him specifically. But since we're still at the topic of experiments, there is a question on YouTube, actually, from Andrea Roșu, who is apparently an undergraduate. So it's very nice that an undergraduate is asking questions. So I will read it out loud. Are there any methodological differences in the practice of experiments between alchemy and early chemistry? Did chemistry rise by purging alchemy of an esoteric and philosophical ideas only? And did it change also the experimental methodology of alchemists besides adopting a more democratic approach to experiments?
Thank you very much. A good question. And in a way, one of the most fundamental questions in the whole history of alchemy, which is to say, alchemy and chemistry, are they actually different things, or are they the same thing? Is it possible that this distinction we now have between alchemy and chemistry is actually not one that the historical actors themselves used, or is it one that's a kind of artifact of later writers from the 18th century onwards, when they're trying to establish chemistry as a respectable university discipline, and they're trying to do that by pushing back against what they saw as the excesses of alchemy. And there's actually been a huge scholarly literature about this. So if you're interested in putting this question further, there's plenty that you can read about. What you do find is that nobody really talks about chemistry as a thing that's distinct from alchemy in the earlier periods. Sometimes alchemy is called chemistry, if we want to sort of use the Latin terms of chemistry. So chemia is one Latin term. Chemiatria is chemical medicine. Some writers choose to call alchemy chemia because they think it sounds more respectable. Others just call it philosophy. In fact, philosophy is the term that's usually used to describe it. So you can actually learn quite a lot from looking at the terms that the actors themselves choose to use when they're talking about what they do. But there's this whole palette of chemical practices, or practices which need some kind of chemical knowledge, which don't really seem to be alchemy either. So for example, making gunpowder, various ways of purifying metals, making cosmetics, distilling rose water. So perhaps it helps to think of, rather than alchemy versus chemistry, to think of different kinds of chemical applications, many of which could be grouped under the umbrella term chemia or alchemia. So you might have transmutation as the highest form, when you can actually change the substance of one metal into another, or various kinds of philosophical medicine. And then this sort of penumbra of different kinds of practice. And there's actual traffic between these areas. So for example, in the mid-14th century, when John of Bupercissa writes his treatise about the quintessence of wine, distilled wine was relatively new as a medical technology. So at the end of the 13th century in Italy, there's developed this new kind of apparatus that's able to produce much higher proof distillates of alcohol than had previously been possible. So this was an exciting new innovation. It's used in medicine, and then John of Bupercissa writes about it in the context of alchemy. And for the next 50 years or so, this is the cutting edge of alchemy. The problem is that after a few hundred years, everybody knows how to distill wine, so it's kind of passed out of the more elevated parts of alchemy, so transmutation and philosophical medicine, into just regular pharmacy. Everybody's using it. Housewives are able to distill wine in their own kitchens. So it might help to think of how different kinds of process and different kinds of substance move between areas of philosophical inquiry, university disciplines, craft practices. And I think that can give us much richer answers than just trying to draw a hard and fast distinction. But still, I think in your question, you were trying to get at something more specific, which is alchemy, sort of chemistry with all of this allegorical dress, or to put it another way, is chemistry what you get when you strip all the mystical stuff off of alchemy? And even then, to be honest, it's, we can't tell a very clear story. The word mystical is one that gets abused quite a lot in relation to alchemy. I mean, what's it really referring to? Many deeply religious people saw alchemy as a metaphor, certainly. And many very practical people also had religious concerns that maybe shaped what they thought about the place of nature and change in the world. But there are plenty of people who are following transmutation, who would have viewed themselves as doing alchemy, who tend to play down the allegorical stuff or the religious language as well, and write rather pragmatic sounding recipes. So even then, we can't really just kind of separate it out. I hope that's helpful.
Right. We have been pushing the experimental side of alchemy and questions relating to the experimental fire in the title of your book. But there are a number of other questions that are relating to the other half of the title of your book, and one of the major claims of the book, which is about the Englishness of, or the idea that there is a tradition of English alchemy. Gregory Todd has a question.
Yeah, my name is Gregory Todd, and I'm a late in life graduate student, and did my dissertation in history on the geologist James Hutton and his studies in Paris with Ruel in the 18th century, the chemistry teacher Ruel. And so there's an example where French influence have a very big influence, I think, on Hutton's thinking about geology. And my question was really the extent to which English alchemists had communication with other contemporaries. On the continent, we see that they're reading, of course, the main texts from doctors at Montpellier and so on. But I just wonder how much there's horizontal communication in an area, especially that I know is regarded still as with some suspicion by many people.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming. So it's an important question, and I think I'm going to answer it in two parts. So one is about whether there's anything intrinsically English about alchemy, and one is what happens with these the continental influence. So the medieval tradition of English alchemy is very deeply grounded in continental sources. I mean, that's the most important take home here. It's something that's native to England doesn't just kind of spring up out of some sort of natural English genius. No, they're getting books from the continent, and they're and they're working with what they have there. And the traffic isn't one way. Books are making their way back across the English Channel as well, of course. So from the earliest times in England, in English alchemy, there's an important continental influence. As I said earlier, Ripley would have probably seen himself more as a commentator on Raymond than as somebody who was doing anything particularly new. He was really popularizing the doctrines of his master, just in his own kind of interpretation of them. And Ripley himself actually comments in his famous poem, The Compound of Alchemy, that he could never find a master in England who could teach him the secret of fermentation. So he traveled for many years abroad. He went to Italy in order to learn true secrets. So I think there's probably a strong sense, even among practitioners in the Kingdom of England in the late Middle Ages, that Italy and the German lands was where it was really happening. Now, as we move into the early modern period, sort of 16th century onwards, we can see some tension developing. I mean, this is a period when you tend to see much more patriotic language anyway, something that's especially heightened by the Reformation, which, where certainly in England, the outcome was the English Church, the Anglican Church, as it would later be called. So it was much more important then to try and distinguish what was English from what was Italian, for instance, papal authority. So you can definitely see some of this, some of these background political, religious, cultural factors affecting how practitioners speak about their legacy. So the reputation of Ripley skyrockets in the 16th century because he's seen as an Englishman. And this is a time when, the English crown is having to bring in expertise from abroad in order to make the most of its own resources. So for instance, there was nobody in England during Elizabeth's reign who really knew how to smelt copper properly. So they had to bring in experts from the mining regions of the German lands. And then sort of English investors and practitioners wanted to learn the secrets of how to do it from the German practitioners so that they could then sort of take their place. And the German practitioners aren't stupid, they know exactly what's happening. So they, are perhaps a bit cagey with some of their knowledge. This is something that Eric Ashe wrote about some years ago. But the same thing's happening in alchemy. If you have these practitioners from abroad who claim to have the secret of the stone, then how are you as an English alchemist going to compete with that? You need to have something that you can put on the table in front of the sovereign to persuade her to invest in you rather than these foreigners. And that, I think, is what really gives some kind of patriotic edge and results in what I call the invention of English alchemy in the 16th century. The idea that actually England has its own tradition, which goes back even further than the continental tradition. So they start invoking Merlin as an alchemist, or Saint Dunstan, who is the 10th century Archbishop of Canterbury. Dunstan is reinvented as an alchemist, which is a good choice because he's supposed to have had expertise in gold working, so he'd be a good choice for an alchemist. But of course, the date's really important there. If he's 10th century, that actually precedes the translation of Arabic alchemical texts into Latin in southern Spain during the 12th century. So that would suggest the English tradition is even older. How seriously did they take these claims? It's very hard to say, but they crop up in letters to Elizabeth I from English alchemists. In the 1560s, as I mentioned, Elizabeth hires a Dutch alchemist and gives him a lot of money to practice for her. And it's not an accident that that's the same time that you start seeing all these English alchemists writing to the Queen, trying to get patronage. Obviously, they hope that they'll be able to benefit from the same kind of resource. And in every single one of their suits that I have looked at, some of which weren't previously known, they hark back to the tradition of George Ripley and other English alchemists, often even using the same process that he talked about in his writing, which I think is very telling. I think another reason they had to do that is that alchemy was actually illegal in England at the time, which meant they couldn't tell the Queen they'd already made the stone because then they'd be confessing to having broken the law. So all they can really say is, I know how to do it, I've got the right process, I've done some initial work which was very promising, but then I stopped because a friend told me it was illegal, so I immediately wrote to you, Your Majesty, and please really give me permission and preferably some cash to keep it going. No evidence, sadly, that any of these approaches were successful. Oh, sorry, you also asked me about horizontal traffic with the continent. I mean, hopefully, as these examples suggest, there was quite a lot. You have people coming to England with their expertise, because the 16th century and the early 17th century is a period when lots of alchemical practitioners are moving around Europe, attracted to courts where princes have a reputation for funding alchemical practice, something that Tara Numedal has written about wonderfully. And England's no different. People are going to go and try to get support in England. But we also see English practitioners going abroad and actually trying to kind of pitch English alchemy as a tradition in foreign courts, something that I write about a bit in chapter 8. Thank you.
Daniel Cook had a question about patronage, since we are on this subject. Daniel?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? Do you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Perfectly.
Good. I'm a professor emeritus from Brooklyn College, and my area of expertise or knowledge is Leibniz. And I was intrigued by a question. Leibniz asked Friedrich Hoffmann, the chemist, whether this spiritus igneus, some kind of distillation that he came up with, could be put to a good use. And I was intrigued to know whether this meant there was a bad one. And then my second question is totally off the wall, but you know, they talk about iatrochemistry as a separate discipline of chemistry. And it's implied that it only began being used for medical purposes in the 16th and 17th century. Is that a misnomer? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming, and that's a good question. I'll quickly deal with the iatrochemistry question, because iatrochemistry literally means medical chemistry. Yeah. So, you know, it's as a branch of medicine. I mean, it was just used to refer to medical practices that drew on chemical substances, especially in the tradition of Paracelsus, Van Helmont, and so on.
It's claimed that it started in the 16th and 17th century. So that's a misnomer, yes. Isn't it?
No, that's quite correct, because it was Paracelsus who first started talking about his chemical as chemiatria, which just is the same thing as iatrochemistry. Iatrochemistry is the anglicization of chemiatria. So it was Paracelsus who really coined that term, and it was taken up by Paracelsians. So it would actually be a misnomer to use iatrochemistry to describe pre-Paracelsian chemical medicine. It doesn't mean that people weren't using chemicals in medicine. It just means that they weren't using that term for it. So, you know, John of Upisissa just says medicine when he's talking about his quintessence. And when I'm writing about it in the book, I usually call it alchemical medicine, or to switch things up a bit, medical alchemy. But there isn't a sort of generic actor's term before the Paracelsian usage of iatrochemistry. Okay, and the question about uses, well, this is a good one, because of course you can have fantastic effects and products which actually aren't useful. They might be philosophically interesting, or they might teach you something about nature, but they don't have obvious practical use. So what I suspect is meant here by, you know, a good use is it something that you can monetize? Is this something that can be manufactured? Something that can be used in who knows what, armaments, medicine, refining products. And there's a great deal of interest in usefulness, of course, especially in the 17th century, where definitions of chemistry really broaden a lot, I would say, to include applications in, for example, agriculture, brewing. So the Royal Society, was famously very interested in coming up with useful applications. On agriculture, we've got Oana Mate here, who's really an expert in that kind of improvement literature. So I'd say an interest in the usefulness of any given chemical product would be extremely characteristic of the time.
To remain a bit on the question of patronage, and because you're making such a, in a way, the secondary claim of the book is that there is something English about the English alchemy. And this connects with attempts to find patronage and dedicating treatises to the king and so on. Again, to put this in a broader context, almost every second trade or practical discipline, and sometimes even philosophy, was forced to sue for patronage. Is there any specific about alchemy in this attempt to find powerful patrons that makes it different from other attempts? And maybe because there is a question to that, I would first give the microphone to Zoe Scretti, who has a question about patronage.
Thank you. I'm Zoe Scretti. I'm a doctoral researcher, and I really look at sort of the impact of the Reformation on alchemy in England. So really love the book, and obviously patronage suits are quite central to the book. So I was wondering about the ways in which these patronage suits are framed, and whether they reveal more about sort of the self-fashioning of alchemists, or more about the expectations that were being placed on alchemists to present themselves in certain ways? So yeah, was it sort of an internal pressure or an external pressure?
Thanks very much, Zoe. Good to see you, and an excellent question. I suppose I would say the kind of suits that I've looked at in England don't necessarily reveal the expectations placed on alchemists by patrons so much as they reveal the expectations placed upon alchemists by other alchemists. So you see a lot of self-presentation or self-fashioning, as you term it, in light of what earlier texts say a good alchemist ought to look like. So there's very often a kind of moralizing passage in an alchemical treatise where the writer will tell you what a good alchemist looks like. You know, you're going to be devout, you're going to pray to God, you're not going to, you know, be motivated by, you know, just cold hard cash, you're going to, you know, be clean living, and etc., etc. And then bad alchemists are also characterized. They're fraudulent, they're ignorant, they don't know how to read the text properly. They circulate false practices because they read their recipes literally instead of philosophically. So I think practitioners got a pretty strong sense from their reading matter of how they ought to behave and how they ought to present themselves in order to reassure prospective patrons who might have been reading the same literature that they belong to camp A and not camp B. They are true philosophers, not frauds, which is one reason why they always call themselves philosophers, not alchemists in their letters. So that's the brief answer, but I think the context of patronage is incredibly interesting. And this is really to go back to Dana's question, where she wanted to know if there's something different about alchemical patronage. So there were many areas of interest and inquiry where the prince can sponsor the activity. You know, medicine, for example, is one area in which could often bring alchemists close to the prince. Many practicing alchemists were hired as royal physicians, not just in England, but across the continent. But what I suggest in the book is that alchemy perhaps is distinctive in that it was available to people from different social classes. You didn't have to go to university to read medicine in order to practice alchemy. In principle, you could be the lowest of the low and still be given the secret of the stone. And actually in the text, this kind of rhetoric's often linked with divine revelation. So, you know, the idea that even very humble men can still be given insight. You know, you can really see sort of Reformation, you know, rhetoric coming into the text at this point, although it's also present in the medieval tradition as well. And this seems to empower some practitioners to write to the prince and present themselves. And they actually will say this quite literally. So William Bloomfield, for instance, when he writes to the Queen, actually says that, you know, even though, you know, he's a bit of a diamond in the rough, you know, nonetheless, you know, because God gives this secret to poor men, you know, he feels that he must lay it at the feet of his sovereign. And then there's a haberdasher in London called Richard Walton, who also writes in similar terms to the Queen, you know, saying that, you know, he's never read that God gave the secret of alchemy to any prince directly. Instead, the secret is given to poor men who then go and teach the prince about it. And that kind of rhetoric, I think, is being used here to excuse the fact that these practitioners are actually breaching etiquette by addressing the monarch directly, because that's not how patronage works in the early modern world. You go through intercessors, you know, so you will find someone who will mediate your suit, possibly not even to the intended audience, but perhaps to another mediator. And you have this kind of ladder of patronage. And then if you end up, you know, succeeding in your goals, you know, each of your intercessors basically takes a cut, and you will owe them some of your service. But alchemists seem to have felt they could go straight to the top, which is very unusual. And I think it's because of the nature of the product. If you came upon the Philosopher's Stone, which produces unlimited bullion and can preserve your life and is also presumably a gift of God, the monarch's going to be interested. you know, let's not fool ourselves here. The prince is going to want to know more if you have in fact made that thing. And the writers are well aware of this when they present themselves. And they had some good evidence to go on. I mean, there's a case I mentioned in the book at the end of the 14th century. There's a guy who was clearly counterfeiting money. I mean, there's no, you know, no excuses can be made for this practitioner, John Pygus. He was making false money, and then he was actually false metal, and then he was turning it into coins and then actually buying goods with it on the high street. So that's straight up treason at the time. And Richard II writes to the local magistrate saying, don't execute him yet. Doesn't say why, but I'm pretty sure it must have been because he just wanted to check that this guy didn't really have the secret of the stone, because if he had, then you know, he'd obviously get a pardon.
Jenny, may I press you on Englishness? Because this is one of, for me, this is one of the striking and kind of one of the claims that put me on kind of thinking more about what I know about what does it mean to, the appeals to national feeling, or what does it mean to work or write in English at various time in history and so on. And that's something that I don't buy from your book, and I would like you to persuade me and us on the fact that there is this kind of attempt on the part of alchemists to build an English tradition. And here are some counterexamples. Early modern philosophers really appealed to monarchs for patronage. Galileo is one who dedicated his satellites to the Duke of Florence. Bacon is another one who dedicated the advancement of learning to James I. And one would never thought that this is part of a national enterprise or a part of kind of local, let's not call it national, local enterprise too. It's just part of the patronage process about, you know, we can have a patent and so on. But you seem to imply more into the book, more than that into your book. You seem to imply that there is a generation after generation attempt to build a special tradition that you call it the English alchemy.
Thank you very much. Yes, so it's definitely something to be invented. That's invented. Just to be clear, I'm not claiming that, you know, there actually is an extremely distinctive English tradition. Although I do draw attention to some aspects of the tradition which you know, are found particularly in England. I mean, maybe this would be a good moment actually for me to just step back and say why this is a book about English alchemy and not just a book about all alchemy. You know, I'm not claiming that English alchemy is better or more original or anything like that. It's just that as interest in the history of alchemy grows, it becomes more obvious, I think, that we need more kind of fine-grained studies to see how alchemical ideas and practices actually change over time. And the problem is that to do that on a continental scale is just, you know, it's certainly well beyond my capability. And so by choosing a particular territory to focus on, it allows a greater temporal stretch, because that's what I'm really interested in. It's seeing how the ideas change over long periods of time, because that's the only way that you can really argue for alchemy as a dynamic tradition and not just as the kind of monolithic process that was alluded to at the start of today's seminar. So England is my arena in that sense to actually argue for change over time. And what just really struck me looking at the sources is that they do keep on and on, harking on about the same set of practices and the same set of alchemists. Now, that lineage of alchemists includes many famous continental practitioners. Raymond Lull is a prominent one, for instance. But English practitioners are cited more than you would find statistically probable if these writers are just trying to represent everybody who was influential. And I am left with the irresistible sense that they're being cited for a reason. And this is particularly clear actually when we follow John Dee and Edward Kelly into Bohemia. where Kelly would have been at a court with many other alchemical practitioners. First of all, the court of Wilhelm Rosenberg, who had 200 alchemists working for him. And then, of course, with the Emperor Rudolf II, everybody who has any alchemical skill is going to be hiring themselves to Bohemia to try to tap into this very strong interest in alchemy at the imperial and the noble level. So how do you distinguish yourself? Well, Edward Kelly tries to distinguish himself as an English alchemist, which is why he shares texts by English authorities, which might have been less well known among his friends, among the aristocracy. And I try to follow how he does this in the book. He's basically marketing something that's a bit new. He's coming up with something which he assumes his audience won't have already read. So I think you can see this attempt to invent an English tradition more clearly in a way when you take it out of England and it's thrown into greater relief. But then if you compare what Kelly's doing in Bohemia, it's actually not that different from what the English practitioners are doing in England either, where there is a tendency to group together philosophers like Bacon, this is Roger Bacon, of course, not Francis Bacon, John Daston, another important 14th century authority who's supposed to have been English, even though the current archival evidence suggests that most of his career was actually spent on the continent. In fact, as was Roger Bacon's, let's not forget. So people are being quoted more, I think, because they're English than because they were just authorities. Yeah, I mean, you're right. You're right to be skeptical and you're right to press, but it's precisely because English alchemy can't be very tightly defined. I mean, I wouldn't want to make a claim that, there's one kind of thing and that's English alchemy, hooray, because that just wouldn't reflect the complexity of the sources. But it's that difficulty that actually led me to try and define it rather broadly in the book. So the people I treat in the book are English subjects, so people who are English, even if they didn't necessarily write in English or didn't spend all their time in England. People who wrote in English, even if they actually weren't English, and people who practiced in England, even if they weren't English by birth. So that includes some continental practitioners. So Giles Duerth, who I mentioned earlier, Henry VIII's librarian, he's not English. He was either French or Flemish, and basically started working for Henry VIII's father, Henry VII, and then continued under his son. So it might actually be helpful to think of English alchemy as a sort of cloud of ideas and practices that's roughly floating over the British Isles, but is not confined to them.
Well, Stephen Klukas had some comments and a question here. Stephen, if you want to add it.
Very quickly, because I'm conscious of the time. I was just chipping in really in the chat. One thing that's really quite important is that there was an awful lot of alchemical literature in the English vernacular. So there is a sense of talking about an English alchemy to that extent. And you mentioned both these instances in your book, Rafe Rabards in the 1590s and Elias Ashmole in the 1650s, both consciously try to invent an English tradition for nationalistic reasons of their own. So it's not as if, you're inventing an English tradition, you're drawing a historical attention to attempts to invent an English tradition in part.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Yes, you put that very clearly. Yes, I'm not the one inventing it. My sources invented it. I still think it's, we should probably resist attempts to really narrow it down too tightly, because then you will mischaracterize it. But it's undoubtedly the case that the writers themselves saw themselves as part of something English, and they wanted to celebrate that. So Rafe Rabards does so explicitly in his preface to Elizabeth I and the first printing of Ripley's Compound of Alchemy. And Elias Ashmole, so mid-17th century, really pushes this very hard, because the Theatrum Chemicum Britannicum, his collection of English alchemical verse, was designed to provide an English sort of counter to all of this literature being produced in the continents. Because if you wanted English books in mid-17th century England, basically you had to go to the manuscript tradition, really. There were more books being printed, but nothing on the continental scale. So you're quite right, Ashmole, who I talk about in the 9th chapter of the book, he's really pushing this idea of English alchemy as a thing. And in the process, he's praising the value of the English tongue as equivalent to those of other lands. He pushes the Druidic origins of alchemy in Britain. So again, he's leaning back on this idea of an ancient tradition in the British Isles. And he also castigates his own countrymen for not paying enough attention to their own national tradition, and instead forcing people from abroad to have to come to England to learn English in order to read it for themselves. So it's pretty explicit in Ashmole for sure.
Well, I think the key word here is inventing rather than maybe actually being, but there could be a substance to it as well.
The substance is Sarikon.
Yeah, Sarikon, exactly. We are now at the subject of Edward Kelly, and basically this is the hot stuff, right? I mean, it's basically John Dee, an English philosopher, going with Edward Kelly at the court of Rudolf II in Prague. They engage in this angelic conversations. Basically, Kelly starts off as being this scryer, so this he was the point of contact with the angels, and the angels tell him things. This is the main image that we have of Kelly as being this scryer that was basically translating angelic conversations for Dee, including the fact that the angels told him to swap their wives, and this kind of intriguing things which was later published in English literature in English by Mary Casaubon. But you talk a lot about Kelly as being an alchemist and actually being quite more successful than John Dee. And I think here Ted Hand actually had a question about specifically on John Dee. So Ted, maybe you can ask the question yourself.
Yeah, and I hope this isn't too silly or off topic, but I think it speaks to the character of our Edward Kelly. So I like the way your book, gets Kelly out from under the shadow of Dee, right? We always hear about Kelly as kind of an adjunct to Dee, right? And understand his career as an alchemist in his own right. But so one thing that's long perplexed me about Kelly is, how do we make sense of this wife swapping incident? It just seems so weird. And I wonder, have you turned up anything in your research on the guy that might help us to make sense of that?
Thanks very much, Ted, and it's good to see you here. I actually think that this episode's a good example of how, how we can, in a way, miss out on whole aspects of somebody's life and work because we tend to focus in on particular details. So there have been so many studies of the wife swapping incident, and the problem is that if you narrow in on that, on the tabloid headline, you can miss a lot of the, I think, more interesting contextual material. Because the big question is, I think, not, did they swap their wives? It's why would people put such faith in the kind of instruction that they're receiving or think they're receiving that they would take such extreme action? And that's not the only extreme action that's recorded by Dee. The fact that he left England to begin with, they received very explicit instruction that they were to go with Lasky, because, and there are all these prophecies about Lasky becoming King of Poland and so on, which the actual King of Poland wasn't, I think, very impressed by. So they're already uprooting and making extraordinary changes in their lives on the basis of these supposed angelic communications. So I actually just think the whole wife incident is something else that we put in that group of extraordinary actions, rather than just sort of tugging it out because of prurient interest and so on. So for me, the really interesting question is what's motivating these men? What's driving them to behave in this way? And I think we can see a disjunction between Kelly and Dee, at least in the later period of Kelly's success. in Prague. I mean, I'm often asked, you know, is Kelly a fraud, you know? And the fact is, how do you answer that question? I mean, he might have really believed he was talking to angels. The problem is belief is something that's very hard to extract out of text. It could have been an extremely clever and intricate con job, or it could have been absolute faith in what was happening, or I think more likely it's somewhere on a continuum between those. But what I think we can see during the period in Bohemia is that Kelly realizes that the angel conversations and prophecies aren't working for him anymore. Dee is, you know, Dee might have been the patron back in England, but in Bohemia, he isn't really. And the people he wants to impress, like Rosenberg, just aren't impressed by the prophecies. What they're impressed by is alchemy. And so Kelly, and this I think is the real take home about Kelly, he's very versatile. And I can't imagine what he'd be like in person, but he must have been extraordinarily charismatic because he's able to constantly reinvent himself and to succeed in each reinvention. So, you know, he's able to absolutely convince both the emperor and the emperor's right-hand man that he is, you know, an extremely effective alchemist, despite the fact that there were many other alchemical practitioners around who were making the same claims. And despite the fact that he initially came to Bohemia, as far as we can tell, claiming expertise in a completely different area, which was angelic communication. So I think what we can see here is an exceptionally versatile practitioner. How was he able to, you know, succeed in practice as well as he apparently did? Well, as I argue in the book, he is drawing on many of the authorities that we know were well represented in Dee's library, including books which we know went to Bohemia. So I can sort of imagine Kelly, you know, quickly leafing through some of Dee's books and extracting treatises which he thinks are going to be powerful in a patronage context. For example, a text which was originally attributed to George Ripley called The Accusations of Raymond, which somebody who might have been Kelly, could well have been Kelly, but I don't have enough archival evidence yet to really knock this one out of the park. Somebody removes all of the kind of post-10th century references from the text and attributes it to St. Dunstan. And then Kelly hawks this text around in Bohemia as an ancient English work. So, you know, somebody knows how to manipulate a library for patronage purposes. Well, if that doesn't sound like the mixture of Dee and Kelly, I don't know what is. So, books and power and persuasion.
We have a question on the YouTube from Gary Patterson relating to intellectual honesty and fraud, and I think that this is the moment to address it. So where do you draw the line? Do you take this into consideration? Do you draw a line about intellectually honest alchemists and fraudulent alchemists?
Thank you. I mean, in general terms, in terms of pronouncing on particular individuals I treat in the book, you know, I think historians, as historians, we have to have a little bit of, you know, humility here. We can't always pronounce, it's not always clear. I mean, Kelly's a good example. You know, it's very easy to say Kelly's a fraud, but, you know, he was clearly able to do something because he was able to persuade successive audiences that, you know, he had skill, and this was a sophisticated, not a naive audience. So I try to be rather careful about pronouncing individuals fraudulent. What I can say is there was a very strong sense, both among practitioners and I think among our audiences, that there is a fraudulent kind of practice and there is a good philosophical kind of practice. And everybody wants to present themselves in the second camp, not in the first one. And I actually talk about this in the first chapter of the book, where I try to distinguish between the legal status of alchemy and the philosophical status of alchemy. So the legal status of alchemy from the start of the 15th century is that multiplication of metal is a felony. And the reason for that legislation is basically, I think, to seal up a loophole in the law. So it's illegal to counterfeit the coin. I mean, counterfeiting coinage has always been treasonous. But that doesn't really cover false metal. What if you make a metal alchemically that looks like gold or silver, enough that you can sell it to the mint, so it's then melted and goes into the coinage, but it's not actually gold or silver. You know, so you could actually debase the prince's coin by selling false metal to the mint. So the multiplication loophole sews that up. And I think that gives us a good sense of the kind of concerns that princes had. They were concerned about the coinage. So on the one hand, they wanted to investigate alchemy in case it could produce gold and silver bullion, which was in very short supply at the time. But they were also nervous because of rampant currency crime. So the kind of currency crime that English princes would have been most familiar with wasn't transmutation, it was counterfeiting, clipping of coinage, making false metal, and so on. And so there'd be a lot of temptation, I think, to look askance at an alchemist as someone who could potentially fall into that bracket of currency crime, sometimes with good reason. There's certainly evidence of people who were arrested for counterfeiting and then sort of claimed, well, actually, I was just doing alchemy. And not just in an English context either, that also happened across Europe. And then there's the philosophical status of alchemy, the kind of counter argument to that, to the earlier view, which is that actually alchemists don't fake gold and silver, they really make it. So it can't be fraud if you're actually changing the substance of the metal. If you're producing a kind of radical change. And, you know, I think any prince would be very happy to be persuaded of that argument if an alchemist turned up and really could transmute gold and silver. I don't think they would end up in prison at all, quite the contrary. The sad story for the alchemists is that that never happened.
Well, we are actually out of time, so it's probably a good point to end. And thank Jenny very much for participating in our discussion and patiently answering all the questions that have been thrown at her, and there were quite a lot. And I encourage you again to read, or if you already read, reread the book, as I did. I mean, it's my second time now, The Experimental Fire. Actually, our discussion of experiment will continue in the next installment of the English Language Philosophical Cafe on 16th of April, where we will be talking on a topic that we have started discussing on, which is experimental history, so recreation and reproduction of past experiments. We will be doing some experimenting ourselves, actually, as we will have none less than 7 speakers, including Jenny, but also Bill Newman, who has talked on at the Philosophical Cafe before, and also Sven Dupre from University of Utrecht, and several others. So we will see what comes out. It will certainly be an interesting experiment. And I look forward to seeing you at that discussion. So thank you, Jenny, again, and thank you everyone for coming and asking questions and participating. It was all.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you very much all. See you next week in Romanian and in 3 weeks in English.